The counterculture of the 1960s was a product of the mass conformity in the United States during the 1950s. The children of the baby boom period rejected the social norms of their parents, which was manifested through anti-war protests against Vietnam, the civil rights movement, as well as activism in feminism, environmentalism, and LGBT movements. These movements and political activism influenced the politics and economics of the 1960s, but also in the United States from then on. There were also changing views in drug use, sexuality, music, fashion, art, and literature, which forever changed pop culture in the United States.
Most of the changes to pop culture were spurred by protests. One of the main changes to pop culture through the 1960s was in music. Music began to shift to more edgy topics with lyrics aimed toward the anti-war mindset, peaceful interactions, and social and civil rights. Festivals like Woodstock, which were largely a new creation, brought together people synonymous with these social views. These festivals represented the mindset and views of the people and performers who are a part of them. Today, music festivals still provide a place for people with common interests to gather and are very popular. Sasquatch and Paradiso are two examples of festivals in the Northwest. Artists like Bob Dylan and Pink Floyd brought lyrics aimed at protests, the Beach Boys with peace, love, all with a new electronic approach to music.
Drug use became more widespread during the 1960s through the counterculture movement, especially the use of marijuana and hallucinogenics like LSD. During the 1960s, the use of heroin and cocaine was not as commonplace, but still influential. The use of drugs was associated with feelings of unity, spirituality, and rebellion of youth against authority. This drug use was very influential with music and is linked with changing psychedelic themes, as well as bringing drug use into pop culture. Drugs within pop culture is still very prevalent today and is still connected with ideas of anti-authority. Hip-hop and rap, as well as the drug culture and anti-authority associated with it, is arguably the most popular form of music today.
There have been many important iconic figures during the 1960s. Through the counterculture movement, one of these figures was Abbie Hoffman. Abbie was an activist leader during the 1960s and was a leader to the hippies during the era of the Vietnam War. He was the man who had organized the Yippie Group. The Yippies were a group of activists who had opposed the social norms of the 1960s. Many people looked up to him because of his idealistic views and was loved because of his smart tactics and his vocalization of the strong opinions he had about the Vietnam War. The creation of the Yippie Group by Hoffman had led its way up to the social movements in today's society. He had influenced pop culture by using rebellion within his protest method, ultimately fighting for the soldiers to try and bring them back home from the Vietnam War. Another iconic figure throughout the 60s and 70s was Betty Friedan. Friedan was an American author. She had fought for women's rights and had published a book called The Feminine Mystique. The story analyzes and breaks down the ideal and conservative gender roles within the 60s and 70s. When taken for face value, society seemed to dismiss the idea of women playing more prevalent roles within society due to the fact that they were expected to follow the lines laid down by their parents. As time progresses, the women portrayed within the story begin to ultimately undergo identity crises as they question the value of their lives. After gaining mass recognition publicly, young women throughout the United States took action to break down societal walls.
The social issues that protests revolved around in the 60s include the civil rights, women's rights, the student movement, the anti-war movement, the environmental movement, and LGBT rights. Many of the protests in the 60s began as small groups of students projecting their voices peacefully. In 1965, after the United States had taken action in Vietnam through multiple bombings, these minuscule movements back at home quickly gained a notable base of support and was followed by radical youth throughout the states. As the conflict in Vietnam dragged on, the casualty rate drastically grew. This once bleak movement had become an influential base of protest in the United States. A Gallup poll in 1968 showed only 35% of the United States population approved of President Johnson's actions in Vietnam, while a whopping 50% had disapproved. Anti-war protests extended to all races and social classes in the U.S. Opposition to the drafting system was common amongst African Americans because of discrimination on domestic territory. In desperation, many draft dodgers would flee to Canada when faced with criminal charges, gaining them up to 5 years in prison, and potential federal fines up to $250,000.
Without the counterculture movement of the 1960s, the various social reforms following this movement might not have taken place.
Alternative ideas and lifestyles common to today would not have been possible if not for the influences created through the social changes of the 1960s.
Pop culture, void of counterculture influences, might not have evolved into the diverse centers of ideas and sometimes radical messages seen in today's society.
And that's all I have to say about that.